Dr. Melinda Karp founded Phase 2 Advisory after nearly 20 years conducting research on education reform and working with colleges. Melinda served on the board of the Brooklyn Kindergarten Society from 2009 through 2018, and is the current board co-chair of the Breakthrough Denver Advisory Board. She also chairs the Institute of Education Sciences What Works Clearinghouse Effective Advising Practice Guide Panel, and is a member of the inaugural editorial team for the Journal of Post-Secondary Student Success. Melinda has worked with individual colleges and reform-oriented learning communities across the country to apply research findings to transformational reform processes. Melinda is well known as the former assistant director at the Community College Research Center at Columbia University. So welcome, Dr. Karp, to this session. This is our first ever virtual conference, and so we are so excited to have you here today. We do have, we've had almost 700 people register for the conference, 200 plus colleges represented across the country. And so welcome this morning, and I will let you take it over.
Thank you so much. And I am going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully you don't see all of the windows that are open, although that is certainly a risk these days. There should be in a minute. There we go, the slides. Can you see them? Yes? Okay, great. So good morning. Hopefully it's later than 7:30 where most of you are. I'm Melinda, and I am the former assistant director of the Community College Research Center. I am the founder of Phase 2 Advisory. We are a small consulting firm that focuses on translating the research into practice on campuses. So essentially, I spent almost 20 years deeply engaged in studying and understanding what does and doesn't work for students in community colleges, and kind of got sick of academia and of writing papers and wanted to figure out how to do all of the things that we kept recommending. So we now do a little bit of research, but mostly I think about what does the research mean for folks like yourselves who are trying to do better for our students. And of course, this work started long before the pandemic. I will make the case later this morning that it is more urgent than ever. I feel like I spent the first 10 years of my career trying to demonstrate how critical everything that happens outside of the classroom is for students, right? That this pedagogy is, of course, what happens in the classroom matters, but what happens outside matters just as much. And for a long time, it felt like we were tilting at windmills. And then we got traction, and I feel like one of the very, very mixed blessings of this pandemic is a new acute awareness of how critical the work that you do in advising and student services is to ensure that students are able to achieve their goals in higher education. So what I want to do today, that's me, that's what I just said, but you can see me, so you don't need my picture. What I want to do today is do three things. First of all, make the case for why we need to redesign student supports on college campuses. And this is really the case for not blaming any individual, but talking about the systems within which advising and student supports function and why they need to be rejiggered to better serve students. I want to talk about one strategy for doing that, which is a student success team. It's not the only way, but it seems to be a pretty popular approach right now. And so I want to talk about what that looks like and how you get there on your campus. And then I want to move into the fact that it's 2020 and really honor the fact that we are all in a crazy moment. Things feel really uncertain, and I think a lot of folks question what can and should we be doing, and make the case again that this is even more urgent. And so the strategies that we're talking about are still relevant even as we stay online or hybrid, and more urgent for our students. So let's talk about why we redesign student supports. And I want to go back to when I was a researcher. So I'm a qualitative researcher by training. That means that I actually talk to students and staff and faculty, and I've talked to, I don't know how many students on how many campuses over the years. I always like to talk about the genesis of this line of research and reform, which really goes back over a decade. Back when at CCRC, we were still trying to understand why community colleges didn't work for students. And so we were doing an interview study, and we were talking, it was a pre-post study. We talked to students on 2 college campuses. We talked to them during their, I believe it was their 2nd semester of enrollment, and then about 18 months later to understand why they did or did not persist. And I was talking to the student, and I don't remember his name, partly because it's been over a decade and partly because you blind people's names when you do research. We'll call him Jose. He was a very typical community college student. He was Latinx. I suspect that part of his family was undocumented, although he never said that. He was relatively young. He was a direct high school grad. He talked about how he had spent time with his mom cleaning houses. He talked about his desire for education. He was really typical. I remember him because he was so clearly motivated and smart, and he was funny. Like, there are just students who stand out when you do research. He was funny. I really enjoyed interviewing him. And he was a striver, right? Like so many students on our campus. And he, part of the interview protocol was to sort of understand how students used all of the amazing resources on campus, right? So tell me, have you gone to tutoring? Have you taken a student success course? Have you seen an advisor? If so, where did you hear about these things? How do you know about them? Those kinds of questions. And I so remember this because we're walking through this protocol, and I'd say, did you use tutoring? And you'd say, well, no. Well, do you know about it? Well, yeah, I saw a sign on the wall. I probably should have gone. Did you take a student success course? I think the answer was probably no, but I heard about it. And we got through this list of all these rich offerings done by really dedicated people on campus. And he looked at me and he said, you know, it's my fault I didn't do as well as I should have first semester, because there's all this stuff and I just didn't use it. And it broke my heart because he was blaming himself. And what was really devastating about that was, sure, on the surface, that's true. He should have gone to tutoring. Fine. When we did the analysis across the students we studied, we realized a couple of things. The students who were most likely to use those services were the students who had entered college with the most, what we call social or cultural capital in sociology. So they were the ones who were from families who were familiar with college, or had siblings who had been to college, or who had participated in activities to prepare them for college. The students who needed the help the most, for some reason, were not accessing the very services that were there to help them. And on top of that, when we looked at who stuck around, who persisted, and this was a small study, it was qualitative, there was a correlation between the students who used services and the students who did better, which meant there was also a correlation between the students who showed up at college able to access those services and the students who were able to persist, which meant that these services were perpetuating inequality even on a community college campus. And that was devastating. And part of it was the students themselves were befuddled. They look like this. So Jose is just one example. I hear this, I heard it in a focus group I did this week. There's tons of stuff on campus. I didn't know how to access it. I didn't know it was there until I physically went to campus and read something on a bulletin board. They don't read it on bulletin boards in 2020, but you get my point. They look like this. And so this led us down because it was devastating, right? You've got all these smart, motivated people on campus doing really good work, and yet for some reason the students aren't realizing that. And we heard that story over and over again. I should have used the services. I didn't know about the services. I felt like there were so many offices. So we started to do this research around, well, what's going on here? It's kind of a conundrum if you think about it, right? Because you've got really great stuff happening, and yet you're not seeing that impact in the student experience and the student outcome. So what's going on here? And what we realized, and this was commensurate with a lot of areas of inquiry, certainly if you've heard of guided pathways, this is the same story. This befuddling sense of like, there's really great stuff happening on campus, but we don't see it in student experience and student outcome. So we started looking at the organization, of the college as well as of student services in particular. And what we realized was there are amazing humans doing amazing things on the student services side of the house and on the academic side, of course. But there's not a lot of organizing structure that meets the needs of students. So it's not the programs themselves, it's the way the institution is set up. And I want to be really clear about that. This is not a people story. This is an organizational structure story, which is why we need to redesign and reorganize services. This is about the fact that for all sorts of reasons, community colleges, broad access universities, most of our large public institutions have been starved for dollars, as we know, and they're about to be starved more. And so they have developed systems that were very much focused on getting students in the door, doing it efficiently, right? Dividing up labor to try and maximize resources from the perspective of the institution. And so they've developed structures that now, these were developed in the 60s and we're 60 years later, those structures don't work for the students who come to the door. So what we found was that services and supports are fragmented on most community college campuses. They exist, but they're kind of all over the place. Because of the large numbers of students and the resource inefficiencies that demands, students tend to receive generic support from a generalist advisor, or they get no one. Because I have been on campuses where they wait 7 hours to see an advisor. By the way, don't tell me those students aren't motivated or gritty. They're gritty. I don't wait 7 hours for like the DMV. But they're not getting deep personalized support, because if there's a line out your door that's 7 hours long, you're not going to be spending 30 hours with a student. Like, it's just not going to happen. Again, that's not the people, that's the system. Colleges realize that it's more efficient to provide information than to build metacognitive skills. So if I have a line of 7 hour long line outside my door, I'm going to give students information and hope they use it, rather than, because I can't, spend the time to explain to students, this is how you use it. This is when you use that information. This is what you do with it. And it's really important, if we think of student services as a piece of the learning enterprise, to remember that it's not enough to provide information. We know that in the classroom too, right? You can't just lecture, despite what I'm doing right now. You've got to teach. And because of our lack of efficiencies, generally student services end up providing information. And that information is not always accessible to students when they need it, right? I give you a list of, in orientation, of all the services that you might need. That doesn't mean that in November, when you need them, you remember what they are, your list is available, you feel comfortable asking for them. But that efficiency play comes in, that colleges typically focus on providing information because that's all they can do for the vast number of students they're trying to serve. And finally, what colleges do tend to do is say, okay, we know that this is imperfect. We've got to provide better support. So we're going to focus our limited resources on subsets of students. There are small programs that target, and we'll talk about these in a minute, target subgroups, particularly minoritized students, first-generation students. But also what they do, colleges tend to do is say, okay, we'll focus on our first-year students, for example, or our incoming students, because that's all we can afford, and we know the first year matters. The problem is, and it's really weird to use this analogy in the middle of a pandemic, student success is not the flu, right? Student success is not polio. You cannot inoculate your way to completion, because the needs that students have evolve. So if I give you all the support in the first year, what happens in your third semester, right? I've come to realize that it kind of is like the flu, actually. We need to inoculate over and over and over again against failure, right? Because what students need their first year is different than their third year. A student who comes to our college not needing basic needs support may encounter challenges that means that a year and a half or 2 years later, he or she does need emergency aid. So we can't just assume that serving our first semester students, as critical as that is going to propel them all the way to completion. We see that in the data, and I'll share that in a minute. So this is the first thing we realize, like, there's something going on with the organization of services. And I'll show you an example. I'm a new transplant to Colorado and Denver, so I'll pick on the Community College of Denver. They're my new hometown. This is how we tend to offer services, and this illustrates the point I was just making. There's a ton you can do at the Community College of Denver to get support. But I don't know how to navigate it, particularly if I'm a first-generation student. If I'm a minoritized student, do I know which of these, like urban male initiative, that's also just like, that's coded. What do we mean by urban male? It's often our Black men. Is that for me? I don't know. Women intentional about success and excellence. I don't know if that is for me. So there's a lot here. I don't know if I need help with something. Do I go to TRIO? Do I go to the Phoenix Center? Probably know if I'm a veteran. There's a lot to navigate here, right? And so for a student who maybe is coming to campus with no experience in his or her family in college, or wondering because they didn't do so well in high school or they've been out of school for a long time, is this a place for me? Despite the fact that there's a wealth of support, it doesn't feel necessarily welcoming, right? Because it's very fragmented. Who do I go to when? How do I know how to ask for help? How do I get into these programs? And what do I do if I'm not sure I qualify? Where do I go then? So most campuses have set this up their services in this way. And we realize that that's really hard to navigate. Sociology tells us, behavioral economics also tells us that lots of choices without architecture can actually be counterproductive. So this is an example of that. The other thing we realized over time was that students don't see the different pieces of their lives as separate. So when we fragmented our student services, and we did that again to allow for specialization, right? Someone's gonna specialize in careers, someone's gonna specialize in academic planning, someone else is gonna specialize in counseling. When we did that, it made sense institutionally and organizationally and professionally. It doesn't make sense for students, right? Students are studying on the subway, or they're studying on the bus, they're studying at their jobs. They're thinking about, how do I balance my academics with my family obligations? And so to separate out this idea that first you go to talk to someone about your academic plan, and then you go to the career office, and then you come back and refigure out your plan. It doesn't make sense pedagogically. It doesn't make sense from the student's point of view, because those things are all intertwined. If I'm going to have a conversation about my ultimate goal, be it graduation, certificate completion, transfer, I need to talk about where I'm going. What is that career area I want to focus on? And how do I back map that academic plan? And how do I figure out how to make a plan that honors all the other identities and pieces of my life? So when we organize our services in a fragmented way, we're sort of artificially creating questions, not to mention just a bounce around for students, that doesn't work from a learning and developmental and student life course perspective. All of this to say, it's not the services, it's the way we set them up, which implies that if you could redesign your delivery, rethink the way you structure and use your human capital, you might be able to create a set of services and supports that's more authentic to student needs and better meets the needs that they have. So we started to think about this, and we got to a place where we wanted to understand, all right, so if you want to rebuild the plane, what do you need to do? And so we took a really deep dive into the literature. And we said, well, what are the examples of programs that work? And what do you need to do to make the system work for everyone? And we did 3 literature reviews, pretty rigorous, couple hundred articles, white papers, etc., journal articles. And we looked, and many of them I want to point out, we're pulling from the small programs that exist on most campuses. So looking at TRIO, looking at programs that target minoritized students like Puente and Ujima in California, looking at smaller student services programs, and understanding what works. So we wanted to say, okay, if these programs are successful, what are the things that are common that you could leverage and redesign around. And we found what we call mechanisms, because it's not really the name of the program, it's what they do, right? Everyone has a student success course. They look a zillion different ways. So what is that course doing? What is that mentoring program doing? They do one, usually more than one, of these four things. And what's interesting is that they're actually the inverse of the challenges I shared with you a minute ago about the current structure. So the programs that work create relationships. Students want a person. They need a human. I think we all know this now when we've all been stuck at home. Humans need humans, and students want those relationships, and those relationships bind them to campus. They give them information, they make them feel welcome, and they give them a reason to come back. So the first mechanism is to create those relationships, which is really hard to do when you're in a drop-in advising situation, for example. But the successful programs build a relationship with a person over time. That doesn't mean that that person needs to know everything a student needs, but that person becomes a point person, a safe place, hopefully, and a starting place to say there's someone who has my back and who can get me my information. The second thing they do is they clarify aspirations and create commitment. They help students understand why they're in college, why it matters, where they're going, why that really random class that they hate might matter for their future. It helps them commit to sticking around even when the going gets tough. So this is where we talk about relating career and academic planning, for example. The third thing they do is develop college know-how. Higher ed is a culture unto itself. Like every organization, again, I'm a sociologist, so we think about norms and cultures and structures a lot. Every organization, every family, every institution has a culture. If you've been born into that culture, you kind of know the rules. There are rules in every culture. Think about your own family. Think about parenting. There are implicit rules. We, as people who have chosen to make our careers in higher education, implicitly understand those rules. They make sense to us. We know what to do. We know how to follow them. If you are not part of this culture, some of those rules don't make sense. And if you don't follow them, you are penalized by giving the bounce around across offices, by not living up to course standards, by getting bad grades, by just feeling really out of place and uncomfortable, like these are not my people and I do not belong here. And if you feel that way, you're likely to leave, because why would you stay? You don't belong. And so helping students develop the know-how to navigate higher education. And I want to point out that that includes ensuring that our minoritized students understand how to navigate higher education given that identity. And that's an important piece of this, right? If we think about equity, college culture feels and has different rules for students from different backgrounds and identities. So it's not a monolithic higher education culture, and we want to acknowledge that as well. But helping students understand how to do college. What does it mean to have a syllabus? What's the bursar? Like, dumb word, first of all. Let's call it the place you pay. But if you don't know what the bursar is and someone says, go to the bursar, and then you're like, but I don't know, and maybe I shouldn't ask because maybe I'm supposed to know, and then I don't feel good about it. Like it creates this thing, and we know this from social psychology, that cycle of feeling out of place reduces academic achievement and reduces the likelihood a student will stay. So developing just that college know-how is critical. And finally, and I'm really proud of this one, because when we put it in the first literature review almost 10 years ago, there wasn't a ton of empirical data, but we knew this mattered. And in the intervening decade, we've really built our knowledge base about making college life feasible. Students who cannot get to class, well, now they can Zoom, assuming they have an internet, but students who do not have DSL, who do not have Wi-Fi, students who do not have a laptop, students who do not have food, students who are worried about shelter cannot learn as effectively as students who are not worried about that. It is an educational question of how to make sure that college life is feasible for students. If you care about equity, you have to acknowledge that what happens off of college campuses matters for student learning. And the programs that are successful in helping propel students to completion acknowledge that, honor that, and try to mitigate it by creating structures, mechanisms, and supports that make college life feasible for students who may be really ready to learn, but like don't have internet, right? So these 4 things, it's early, that was 8, this is 4. These 4 things matter. We know that from the evidence. If you can pull that off, you will propel students to completion, transfer, or whatever their aspiration is. The lovely thing about these mechanisms is that they actually lead you to a set of design principles. They kind of tell you what to do. Not only does it say like you need to redesign student services, but it says this is what you should do instead. We call it the strategy, we call it SIP. It's an acronym. It essentially argues that if you do these 5 things at scale for all your students, you are likely to improve completion rates. You need to create, and it's kind of the opposite of what I talked about before. You need to create sustained engagement, right? Don't inoculate, create these relationships that are long-term, that are strategic. And we've been strategic before, but in the wrong way. That division of labor was an attempt to be strategic and make do with limited resources. You've got to differentiate services, but you got to do it differently. You cannot yet, in the foreseeable future, meet with every student on campus for 30 minutes every other week. Like, capacity ain't gonna happen. So you've got to be strategic in other ways to ensure that you get that sustained engagement with students. You want to integrate those services, right? I just talked about how the career office over here and academic advising over there makes no sense developmentally and educationally. So how do we integrate services so they feel seamless and frictionless and authentic to students? You want to be proactive. We know from the literature that the students who most need the help, think back to Jose, they're the ones who are least likely to ask. So you have to come to them because they are unlikely to come to you, at least at first. And you need to personalize it. Students tell us over and over again that they don't want to feel like a number. They need the help that they need when they need it. And we can't assume that every first semester student needs the same thing. And they want it from someone who knows them, which goes back to that sustained approach. If you could do these design principles, you are likely, very likely to increase your retention and completion rates. And you want to know how I know that? Because this is my favorite slide. These are 5 different versions of SIPI, now I'm making it an adjective, SIPI programs. So these are 5 programs that use the design principles I just shared of SIP in different ways. The beauty of a design principle is it's not a recipe. You got to figure out what works on your campus, but they do SIP. So CUNY ASAP is the one that most people have heard about. It's a really integrated program at the City University of New York. It provides intensive long-term support. It provides Mechur cards. It provides career support, etc. It was replicated in Ohio, which is the one all the way on the right. They did not do Mechur cards because they don't have the subway in Ohio. They used gas cards instead. They modified a couple of other pieces of that. Inside Track is actually a coaching, actually a remote coaching approach where coaches reach out to students via text and telephone and email. And Stay the Course was using master's MSWs to support students at a college in Texas. Now, all of these programs were SIP, again, slightly different ways of doing SIP, everything from telephone coaching to MSW social workers. But all of them participated in randomized control trials, which means there's just sort of the gold standard in research if you're a research wonk like myself. Basically what they do is they recruit twice as many students as the program can fill. Half the students randomly get the intervention, half the students get business as usual. So you can assume that any impact that you see is not because of differences among the students, because they all wanted to be in the program. It's because of the intervention. So it's kind of the gold standard evaluation research. So every single one of these programs did a randomized control trial, and every single one of these programs was able to follow students to completion. And every single one of them statistically significantly, and in some cases massively statistically significantly, improved completion rates. So the treatment, the students who got SIP are the dark blue, almost black. The control, who got what we normally offer, are the pink. And you can see the differences. I mean, CUNY ASAP, they doubled their numbers of students who completed in 3 years in an urban community college using SIP. So I don't often say things work because I'm a researcher and we don't like to say that with a lot of certainty. I feel like SIP works, right? So it's really exciting. I will say that if I showed you a couple of other interventions that were SIP but not sustained, they were 1 or 2 semesters, you would see similar impacts for retention. What's important to note there is that when they pulled those training wheels away, the impacts fade over time. So that's another example of why we need to sustain that engagement. So for example, mentoring, randomized controlled trials of mentoring show similar kinds of impacts for persistence. But if it's a short-term mentoring program, over time, we lose that impact and it doesn't get us all the way to completion, but it matters in the short term. So the idea that if you redesign how you support your students, you can get to completion. The other thing that is so critical is that students tell us it matters. So this is a new report that was looking at a coaching approach to SIP. So these were using coaches in a number of colleges and community colleges in North Carolina. And this is what students said. And they basically said the coaching created SIP and the SIP mattered. They had a personal connection. They had someone helping them identify barriers. They had someone to encourage them. It's someone to connect them to the resources that they need. So the students also, and it's so important to me that we talk about the student voice in this. It is critical that we listen to students and they tell us this matters. So we've got impact data that matter, and we've got student voice that says this approach is critical. I see that, Lindsay, you raised your hand. What I would love to do, and I do love that you can do this, and you actually did it at a great moment. I want to pause because it's a lot of me talking. It's a lot of talking heads, a lot of Zoom. And I want to take a moment to reflect, and I would love to use, rather than raising your hand, if you can just put your questions in the Q&A. I will try and answer them as we go or at the end. But I want to pause, and it's hard because I can't see your faces, but I do want to give you a minute to reflect and put those questions in the chat on what I've just shared with you. So I've made an argument that we need to rethink how we support students. And I'd love you to take a couple minutes and to do 2 things. You can write it just to yourself in your brain, or you can put your answers in the Q&A, and also put your own questions in the Q&A around, if you think about your own college, to what extent do you currently enable SIP-like supports? And what might you change to become more SIP-y? And I'm gonna give us a couple minutes to reflect, even if we're very quiet. I think it's important to pause. Also, if you need more coffee, you can reflect while you're getting coffee. Are we good on that? And then, like I said, if you have questions, use the Q&A, and I'll try and answer a couple before we move into the next section of the presentation. Does that work? Okay, so it's gonna be awkwardly quiet while people ponder and hopefully use the Q&A to give their answers and or questions. Sarah, I said I was gonna be quiet, but I see your question about that's a great point, Julie. I'll put the principles on. The ratios, hold tight on that ratio question because it's a real issue, and I'm gonna share with you strategies after our reflection, because you're totally right. Ratios are tricky. And those are the principles. So I'm going to give you about 1 to 2 more minutes to reflect, and then I'll move into questions and the next section.
The chat box is the Q&A right at the bottom of the toolbar. So because this is a webinar format, it just says Q&A instead of a chat.
All right, so it's so hard virtually. I can't see if you're done. The teacher and me, this is painful because I can't tell who's still writing, who's still thinking, who's talking about their weekend. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to start by answering some of the questions in the chat. That way, if folks are still pondering, that's great. And then I'll move into the next section because I think that will answer some of the questions. So I want to point out, yes, so Jackie, and I assume everyone can see the questions and answers in the chat, right? So you can, so folks can read for themselves that Jackie's sharing an example, and Rebecca both are talking about various ways of embedding advisors, and that is a strategy, and we're going to kind of get to that in a second. Some of the questions are really like, how do you do this? How did the colleges that we shared do this? And I'm going to gloss it over at a high level, and I am happy to talk to folks afterwards about specifics or share reports. I want to point out that the SIP is not a program. SIP is a set of principles, and so it looks a little different in every program and on every campus. And so to say something is SIPy, which is like not a real word, but I use it anyway, is to say that the approach takes these principles and puts them into practice, and they look different, and that's so critical, in part because we're talking about ratios and how do you do this at scale. The initiatives that I shared with the research were specific programs. They typically do have assigned staff. I think in every single one there is an assigned staff, and that is critical. It's really hard to have personalized sustained support if a student is seeing someone different every time, right? So when you operationalize SIP, that's part of it. CUNY ASAP, I'll use that as an example. They have assigned advisors that the students are required to see, in their case, like twice a month, at least at first, which is a lot. Not sustainable. We'll talk about that. That is a 2 to 3 year program. So for the question about have there been studies done about continuing efforts later on after the first year, absolutely. All of those studies I shared before, except I believe for Inside Track, are multi-year. The strongest studies that we have are multi-year. So that's part of what we're trying to figure out, is how do we support students after the first year, because we know that seems to matter, both from listening to students talk and from the research on studies that do look at institutions that sustain that work, as well as these fade out effects I mentioned, right? So there have been studies done on continuing efforts, and they are critical. I'm going to just skim through. I love that everyone's adding stuff. That means it's more reading for me. Online grad students, I'm going to admit, I'm going to talk about remote in a second. Grad students is not my area of expertise. But I have to imagine it's the same. So there's a lot of examples in here. And so what I'm going to do is, okay, this is a great one. This is an approach where students start with a general enrollment person and then transition to specific after time. This is a really interesting question, and I want you all to pin it in your brain as I talk about success teams. One of the things that we know, there's a dance here with this SIP, right? So one of the things I want to tell you is I'm not going to tell you how to do this on your college. Every college I work with does it differently, and I think that's critical because every college has its own culture and its own resource constraints. I will also tell you that many colleges do this sort of handoff. Students don't love a handoff. They really don't. I would bet that many students continue to go to their enrollment navigator even when they're supposed to go to someone new, because that's who they get to know. So there is a tension here between what works at scale and what we know works for students. Students, if you talk to them, will tell you they want a person. And part of that, again, if we put the student in the middle, they just got to know this person. If we want to do the holistic integrated approach, that means they have to get to a place where they're willing to disclose potentially stuff that's hard, right? You don't do that in the first meeting with someone, usually. So there's a trust piece of this that builds over time. And so if it takes time to build trust, and it takes time to admit that you're struggling financially, or you're struggling in school, or you feel really out of place, to then get handed to someone else means you have to retell those stories, rebuild the trust. And it doesn't feel great for students, and it's not super efficient. So I'm a pragmatist, and so I do think a lot of colleges do this handoff for very good reasons, but it's something that I caution against if you can avoid it. I'm going to skim down quickly just to see if there are other questions. I love these ideas, and I'm wondering if we shouldn't print out the chat later and share it, because there's a lot of tactical stuff in here.
Yes, we could do that.
So I'm going to. Someone can't read the questions.
I'm going ahead and putting them answer live so you can see that.
Perfect. So, okay. I apologize. So I'm going to move on to the next section, and hopefully a lot of these questions will get answered. And if not, you'll have another opportunity. And if I don't answer your question, I am always happy to converse via email. So you will have my email. We can talk about it. But what I want to do is move into how you operationalize these principles. Because as folks are pointing out, easier said than done. I'm not a crazy lady. I get the world we live in. I know the ratios. I spend a lot of time on campuses. It's a challenge. It's why my job is meaty and hard, and I probably, frankly, always will have one, because there's always going to be work to do. In my next job, I'm going to be a lobbyist and try and get more money, because the reality is, in an ideal world, I would wave my magic fairy wand and we would all have more advisors, counselors, coaches, whatever you call them. We would have lower ratios. That wasn't in the cards even before the pandemic. Now I'm really nervous, as I'm sure most of you are. So what I view SIP as is an argument for rethinking how you do your work. It will still probably leave you with high ratios, but it may enable you to handle those ratios differently. So part of what happens now on most college campuses is everyone comes in and they get like kind of a blunt instrument, right? You get, typically, this is a generalization, but students get a quick meeting with someone who they've never met before to figure out their classes. And then maybe that person's name shows up in their Blackboard or their Canvas as their advisor, but they may not ever see that person. If they need help, it's drop-in, unless they're really motivated. But we assume that all first semester students need X, all second semester students need Y, and by third semester, most students can fend for themselves. And I think that means, and everybody gets the same 15 or 30-minute intervention. The reality is, some students don't need to see a counselor, probably. Some students need more than 30 minutes once a semester. The trick is figuring out, so if you could know who doesn't need you and who needs more of you, you could rejigger your time. Instead of using 2 hours evenly split amongst 4 students, you could use 2 hours split among 8 or 10, because some of them are getting an email, some of them are getting a quick phone call, and some of them are in your office potentially crying. We don't always know, because of our systems, we don't always know who needs what when, and that's that personalization. So thinking about operationalizing SIP in many ways is thinking about how do people do their jobs differently, and what are the underlying architectures that enable you to do so. So you all picked up on the fact that we have a ratio problem. Those programs that I just showed you are really small, and their ratios are really small. CUNY ASAP is now, when the study was done, it was 1 to 80. They've scaled it throughout the City University of New York system, and their ratios are closer to 1 to 200 at this point, but still really small. Stay the course, they don't state it, but I remember hearing somewhere that it was also probably about 1 to 80 because they were using MSW social workers. Future Connect, which is another one, modeled on CUNY ASAP, targeting first generation students out in Oregon, also about 1 to 120. Not sustainable for many reasons. So the design challenge, the meaty design challenge for those of us who work in this space and want to provide SIP for more students is, how do you do this with different ratios? And I will say that even these programs are thinking that through, because CUNY ASAP, for all of its excellent outcomes, was actually on the chopping block in the New York City Mayor's office last week. They advocated that away because that was like one of the dumber things that Mayor de Blasio has ever done, and I say that as a New Yorker. But it's expensive. The other thing to point out is that if you rely on these small programs, you don't move your institutional metrics. You do amazing things for those 125 students, but everyone else on your campus is still in the old system. So the design challenge for us, I think, is figuring out how to scale these where you hold on to the good stuff, but get it to more students. So you're not leaving students behind, you're moving your metrics, and you're making sure that everyone has access to this support. That's why you have to rethink your whole structure and architecture. So these are the principles again. One of the things, I love many things about these principles, obviously, because I talk about them a lot, but one of the things that they do is, because they are design principles, not a recipe, they imply what I call a toolbox. And this is how you figure out how to get closer to scale and deal with the ratio problem. So each of the principles in SIP doesn't say thou shalt do blah. It says, here's some things you could do. So for sustained, I do think, you know, it's really hard to do anything sustained without some sort of assignment. But whether it's a counselor, a coach, a point person, a navigator, whatever you call them and whatever they do, you assign it. The strategic piece becomes really critical. That's that architecture around, how do you know who you can get away with just a quick email to and who needs to be in your office? You can use analytics. You can use group counseling. Some students don't need one-on-one program planning. They can do it in a group, right? You can do things like triage, which is a word that I question a little bit, but you can figure out who needs what at intake. So many campuses now use like an intake survey to figure out which students have basic needs. And they get a different level of support than students who on that survey seem to indicate that they're going to be okay with a lighter touch approach. You integrate through things like shared case notes. So there are different tips and tricks, right? So each of these design principles implies a set of tools. And as a campus, you need to start thinking, and this is where the chat is lovely because you can start to see different campuses are already going there, that you can implement different pieces of the toolbox to work on your campus and start to manage your caseload. It still stays hard if you're at 1 to 1,000, but you start to have different tools at your disposal. One of the approaches, and I want to be clear that I'm using this as an illustration of how this plays out in practice, not as an endorsement necessarily, but one of the approaches that campuses are starting to use is something called a success team. Now, none of the programs that I talked about before use this explicit success team approach. They've done it other ways. But on campuses where there are very high ratios, on campuses where you can't get to a dedicated counselor only, this notion of a success team is becoming really prominent. The other reason it's not an endorsement is because we haven't officially studied it yet. But to operationalize SIP on a regular campus, not a campus that can have a ratio of 1 to 200, the success team seems to be a really promising way to knit together the tools in this SIPy toolbox in a way that supports more students and gives them maybe not the same level of intensity as a CUNY ASAP, but something better than what we've been doing in the past. So a success team is kind of what it sounds like. It's a group of people who take responsibility for the progression and completion of a group of students. It's a form of case management, okay? It's saying, not only am I gonna assign you a person, but that person's job is to figure out how to get you to the finish line. And it's a group of people. And the reason we do group is because we want to get to economies of scale and some strategies, right? So the group allows for some of that managing of the caseload and some of those tactics to be strategic. But they take ownership, they case manage as a collective, which is kind of cool. So what a success team typically includes, and these look, again, a little different from campus to campus, is at least as one student services member, often two. Often there's a counselor and a coach or a navigator who has maybe a bachelor's degree and can do not the deep counseling, but a lot of the sort of top line work. They connect on campuses that are involved in guided pathways. They connect to a meta major. So there is division of labor, but it's around content. The success team is expert in health careers, and that's who all the health career students go to. That also enables a conversation between student services and the academic side of the house, because that success team keeps an eye on students in those programs and can talk to faculty. Faculty know who to go to, which is great. They leverage technology in various ways. You don't have to necessarily buy a fancy system. Many campuses are making do with their LMS, but they do leverage technology to facilitate conversation and information sharing, both with students in the caseload, on the caseload, and across members of the success team. They take a case management approach, as I said, and they maintain that responsibility for the success of students from beginning to end. And that responsibility may look different at different moments, but it's our job to get our students through. I'm gonna, again, I see hands going up. I'm gonna ask that if you can use the Q&A, I will get to the end of this and then try and go through the questions again. I wanna give you an example of what this looks like at a college. I'm not naming the college, but I promise you it's real. This is a college that has done guided pathways, and that's like a whole other presentation. So for those of you who haven't really dug into guided pathways, it's the notion of reorganizing the entire college to create stronger architecture for students. And one of the ideas is you group your programs of study in like groups, often called meta majors. And that's almost like a contained curricular and support and engagement part of the college. It gives students a way to navigate and create community. So at this college, they do have meta majors. They call them pathways. And each meta major has its own team. And you'll see that it has a counselor, it has a designated financial aid person, it has an advisor, and it has a career person. That team is responsible, and there is division of labor across that team as to who does what, right? So the educational advisors typically are the ones who do program planning, if it's not complicated, who respond to early alerts or initial challenges with students. They serve, as the name implies, they're often called navigators, to help students navigate as that first point of contact. But they can elevate to other members of the team. If it's complicated, they're gonna go to a counselor. But they can do a warm handoff. If it's financial aid, they're gonna go to the financial aid person, but that financial aid person is familiar with the nuances of the programs in that pathway. So it's not a random stranger in the financial aid office. They know something about you. So on and so forth. When they talk about their success teams, this is actually a quote from their president. I interviewed her about a year ago. It's about being clear on what they do. The success teams enable a new culture of ownership. These are my students and I am responsible. Often because of the way we've structured our supports in the past, nobody really takes responsibility for the student's ultimate completion. You can easily say, well, they should have gone to the advisor or they should have gone to their faculty member. It's not me. And Obviously, it's a group effort, and obviously, ultimately, the student needs to navigate this on his or her own. But this way, there is someone saying, these are my students, and I want them to be successful, and it is my job to figure out how to get them there. I need to connect them to resources by any means necessary. Amarillo College down in Texas has taken this to, this is not Amarillo, but they do this too, where they say it is their job to get by whatever means necessary, through love, support, services, we will get you to the finish line, your finish line. And the success team provides the structure for that, because now every student has a team who's behind them, who's going to help them. And from the student's point of view, they now know who to go to. They don't, if you think back to that website that I showed you from Community College of Denver, and you compare it to this, if I'm a student now at this institution and I need help, I don't have to go to that list of services. I go to my advisor. And that advisor is going to know enough about who I am and what I need to help me navigate that list of services, right? So I don't need to figure it out on my own. So the success team recreates the efficiencies of a division of labor. You've got someone, and this is where we come back to ratios. Typically on a success team, you've got a counselor who's dealing with the hard stuff. And you've got a navigator, advisor, etc., who can deal with a lot of the day-to-day. How do I register? How do I get a laptop loaner? You don't need a 30-minute appointment with a counselor for many of those questions. But we often, that's what happens. Or students wait in a long line to get that answer, when really all they need is an email. And so you manage those larger caseloads by figuring out, like, students go to this person. The person either answers the question or says, please come see my friend and colleague who can help you with more. And then that friend and colleague, the counselor, is not dealing with procedural questions. They can dig more deeply into the needs of the students who need that support. So the team approach helps with the caseload management by being strategic and efficient in a different way. They establishes clear lines of communication, as I pointed out, right? So students know who to go to. Faculty and staff know who to go to. I have a student in my class. I'm having trouble. I think there's something up. Can you reach out to them? It reduces handoffs because you've got this team that you know, and it makes those handoffs that do exist warm. Students don't have to bounce from office to office. They can be brought there and said, like I said, come see my friend and colleague. There's accountability. And it uses this notion of triage and relationship building to start to get to scale. One of the things I want to point out about any SIP redesign, but the success teams in particular, is that it's doing a couple of things at once. And that sounds hard, but it's critical. We know from research that to truly transform an institution and truly transform a student experience, first of all, you need to transform that experience in order to change outcomes. If students don't feel the difference of anything you've done, it's unlikely that it will translate into how they experience and perform in the institution they're learning. But you need to do three things. You need to change the structure, right? So you need to rethink the organization, as I've said. You also need to change the processes, how people do their jobs. It's not enough to just say, like, now you're a team, if everyone's still doing what they always did. This is also digging into how individuals engage with students and with their peers, their colleagues. And that's really hard, but it's critical. If all you're doing is renaming the same thing with new names, but students are still essentially getting a transactional student support experience, it's not really going to change the outcomes, because from a student's point of view, nothing changed. So it's not enough to just say, now we're a team. It's really important to think about what are the behaviors and the forms of engagement that we want our team to enable. You also need to change the culture. And that's a give and take between the structures, the processes, and mindsets of saying, we are going to, despite the fact that we've got ratios we don't like, despite the fact that budgets are getting slashed, we are committed to engaging with our students and each other in a different way, holding on and being accountable the way that president explained. So you've got to do all three. It's not enough to just say, we're going to be a success team. You've got to think about what that really means culturally and behaviorally. Where a lot of these reforms fall short is really digging into the structure without thinking about the behaviors. That said, you cannot change the processes and the norms without thinking about the structures. You cannot do this work if you continue to have drop-in advising and only engage with your first semester students. The structures are the architecture under which a new form of engagement sits, and you need both, right? If you still have a line that's 7 hours long, it doesn't matter how committed you are to doing holistic support, you can't do it. So this is a both and to get to SIP at scale. The success teams are a way to do that architecturally, but they're not enough unless you think about what the people on the teams are going to do. So this is, and I won't read this, you're gonna get the slides. These are examples of what I mean by that, right? So you have to change the structures. You create a point person, you redefine roles and responsibilities, but then you shift the behaviors as well. And then you shift the culture. One of the things I do want to point out is when you start talking about behavior change, it gets really hard. Because particularly in a success team model, jobs are going to look different. Professional activities will look different. If your counselors, for example, are used to doing all of the academic advising, a team approach implies that they won't, because other people can help with program planning in order to free them up, right? Again, we're talking strategy. In order to free them up for other things, they're going to have to let that go. And that is often really hard to let things go. There's also trust involved, right? So all of this is not easy, structurally, fiscally, but also from an identity point of view. You're asking people to do their jobs differently. If you're not asking them to do their jobs differently, you're not actually going to get to SIP. But that's a really difficult part of the conversation because you're shifting roles and responsibilities. It implies professional development. It implies thinking about contracts. It implies lots of things. And I do firmly believe, having spoken with students and staff at colleges that are going this way, it ultimately enhances the professional environment because folks get to do what they've been trained to do. But it's hard. And it is important to remember that SIP is not a program. It's not a structure. It's a combination of structures and norms and professional engagement, which is really different than just saying we're going to launch a new program. So I'm going to stop again. I'm going to ask you to reflect. It's really hard in this online environment to not see your faces, to not be able to fully take questions. And also to have you listen to me. So I want to do a 3, 2, 1 as I read through some of the questions and can start to think about which ones I want to answer. But I really I was a classroom teacher a long time ago for a hot second. So I like to make sure that folks have a chance to reflect and question the work. So again, take a minute to think about 3 things you've learned, 2 things you can put into practice or already have, and think about if they're short or long term. Some of this stuff you can do quickly, some of this is a longer term project. And one thing you're still wondering, I assume a lot of those wonderings are already in the chat, and I'm going to read them right now and answer a couple of them. But wonder for yourself, because you can put them in there, or you can email me later, or you can take it back to your campus and confront it together, because some of these wonderings are going to be things you're going to answer on your own. So again, I'm going to take about 3 minutes to let you pause, grab coffee, take a bio break, and reflect on where we've been. I'm going to read the questions and try and read a couple of them out loud when we come back together in 3-ish minutes. I'm going to give folks about 1 more minute. Okay, so again, you can always keep reflecting, always ask me your wonderings later on. I do want to answer a couple of questions before we move into the final session, where I want to talk quickly about the fact that we live in a COVID world. So I'm going to try and read the questions because I know that not everyone can see them, and they're all over the place anyway. We had a question about the caseload. There are a couple of questions about caseload and digging into the notion of triage. And I wanted to add, the reason I don't love the word triage is sometimes the medical model feels really deficit-based. So the idea that you're triaging kind of makes me nervous, although I think that because I don't like deficit language. But I haven't come up with a better term yet. And I do think there's some value in thinking about some analogs to medicine where there is actually a similar team approach in many places. Interestingly, healthcare is going to a team approach. The idea that you have essentially a medical navigator who directs you to different specialists, but your point person is that navigator or your primary care physician, is very similar to a team approach that we're talking about here. But triage, I'm always cautious about words that imply that some students are needier or more at risk than others, because I think that gets conflated with a deficit mindset often. And I also believe that every student has their own unique needs and their own unique strengths. And what we really want to pull out of this is, how do you find those so that you can meet those needs and build on those strengths for every student when you have a ratio of 1 to 1,000 or more. So one thing to think about, and people have asked in a couple of different places here, is how do we do that strategically? How do we triage? Because that's how you manage a caseload. There are a lot of strategies out there. Predictive analytics is one. That one, if you want to go there, talk to me about that, because there are some serious equity concerns. Because let's be clear, predictions are not fact. So if you say, we predict you to fail, like that opens up a can of worms for me. But as a way to figure out which students to reach out to, many institutions do use that. Similarly, early warning systems, either from faculty, can help figure out who do I need to talk to, who needs, say, a navigator to reach out and dig in a little bit more deeply. Campuses are using, like I said, these entry surveys to sort of bucket their students. This is actually, CUNY ASAP does this as well. Success teams, or if there's not a team, the actual advisor or counselor sits with their caseload. In CUNY's, I think in ASAP, it's every semester. And they sort of look at their caseload and say, off of a set of criteria, right now, these are the students I'm not worried about, and they can get away with an email from me. Right now, these are the students who could kind of go either way. Their grades aren't great, or we've seen them, we know them, so we know we got to keep an eye on them, but they don't need to see me all the time. They maybe need to come see me once a month, once a semester. And here are my students who I'm really worried about because of these criteria. Usually it's something to do with grades as well as perhaps warning, or again, if you're meeting with them, you just know, and I want them to come see me more regularly. And so they do this bucketing off of either surveys or knowing their students. And then they have protocols. And this gets to a second question someone asked. They have actual protocols that say, okay, for the students in the bucket that I'm most worried about, right, and I want to be clear, these buckets are not static. They get moved every semester. For the students in the bucket that I'm worried about right now, this is the engagement cadence that we have. This is my protocol. For the students I'm not worried about, this is the engagement cadence. And so what that does is it alleviates the burden of having to talk to every student in your caseload all the time, right? Because you have a set of almost rules of engagement. And obviously, if a student who's in that I don't worry about you bucket shows up in your office, you help them, but you don't have to reach out to them all the time. And so that's how campuses are thinking about triaging, is they're using tools and their professional knowledge to start to say, this is how we're going to engage with different kinds of students at this moment in time. And that gets me to the question around, someone asked a question around what are the tools that campuses are using to dig into these roles? And I certainly have some templates. I really advocate for building out these things like a cadence, like a protocol that says, here's what we do with students when. And to think about what is the modality of that reach out. Is it an email versus an in-person versus a quick Skype meeting? So what is, I keep talking about the cadence of engagement with students, and to sit down as a team or a college and say, this is the cadence that we want, and here's who's gonna do it. Now, this is why I'm not gonna say, I have the perfect tool for you, because every college, and frankly, every state have slightly different rules around what that's gonna look like. I am a huge advocate of when you go to a success team model, if you choose to do so, you have got to have the hard conversations about who does what on a team. Now, the whole point of a team approach is that if a student shows up in your office crying about something that's not officially on your role, you still help them, you don't kick them out. But you have to know who's supposed to do what. And those are the hard conversations, but really fleshing out, the navigator does these things and the handoff occurs at this point to a counselor. The faculty on our team do these things. Those conversations and writing it down and codifying it are critical, because that's actually how you build the trust. It's also how you ensure that folks stay within their professional scope. It's how you honor contract and collective bargaining, if that's the case in your state. But being really clear, and again, I do have some tools that have been tailored for different campuses. I'm happy to share them. But typically what they do is they clarify the roles of the members on the team. What do they do? What are they responsible for? And then start to dig into that cadence. How are we going to engage? When, in what modality, and for what purpose with the different students or the different subsets of students within our caseload. The final question, there are two other questions. One was about how does this work if you don't have a single student success department, right? Like it feels like this should work better if every student services office is in the same department. And that's true. Although I'll tell you, if you have cross-department functions, right? So, you know, extracurriculars are someplace and faculty are there. There was an interesting survey that just came out from Titan Partners. They're actually an investment bank, but they do a lot of national work on advising. They do a lot of surveying. And what they found was that the campuses that have succeeded in redesigning advising, again, not a specific model and not a specific structure. What mattered was collaboration. So if you are on a campus where your student services offices are distributed, the key is not to get everyone under the same vice president necessarily. What they found was what mattered is how do you collaborate across those offices? If you collaborate, regardless of who supervises you, it seems to be able to work. So it's about collaboration, not structure, which I thought was really interesting, because we assume that being in the same structure would help the collaboration, and that doesn't always seem to be the case. The final question before I move into our COVID world is around where do I start? Because this is really big and overwhelming. And my answer to that is yes, it is. The case making, and again, this is to some extent a campus culture question. I tend to start with students and data. Students are a super compelling way to get folks to pay attention. Unfortunately, right now, you can't do a huge design day, dig into the day-to-day, but you could look at your data, your SESI scores if you do SESI, any institutional surveys you have on how students feel about advising, counseling, and student supports. What I often do when we can gather in person is do things like process map. Ask students to map their journey through admissions to registration or completion, and ask faculty and staff to do the same thing, and then compare and ask, and faculty and staff quickly realize that the systems that make sense for them don't make sense for students. So there are lots of ways to engage in this. I agree with the person who asked the question of the case making comes first. Data and students is what I would say. And then you need to move into really hard conversations about what does our future state look like. If we had more time, I would share with you the need for an intentional design process. Often campuses, and please don't any of you do this, run and they hear me talk and they're like, we got to go to case management. Let's assign everyone advisors. But they don't talk about what the end state of that assigned advisor is. And so what I often argue is to be really intentional in your design phase, to really think about when we are done with this reform process in 2 or 3 years, and that's what it will take, what will the future state look like? Clarify that vision of what student services will look like down the line and map backwards. And that process in and of itself helps you make the case, helps you bring in stakeholders, but also clarifies for folks where you're going and why. And so that's another place to start, is that visioning process. We have about 10 minutes. I can't believe that. I thought this was gonna just, you're asking such good questions and it's wonderful. And again, I'm happy to engage later on. I do wanna bring up the whole, like, we're virtual, it's 2020. There's a lot happening in the world. There's a pandemic, there's an awakening around the way that our country is not being responsive to our Black colleagues and students in particular, but also our Hispanic students, our Native students. This all intersects with student services redesign. Our students are going to show up on campus or virtual campus in a couple of weeks, and there is a lot happening, not to mention the budget. So there's a real sense of what do we do now? What I want to tell you is, and you don't need to read all these graphs, it's a lot of data. People have managed to collect a lot of data in the past 3 months. COVID-19 has increased the urgency of this. This was a national survey done by Ithaca S&R. It's a national research firm. They looked at 2- and 4-year college students. And again, you don't need to read this. Just know that if you look at all of these, the numbers, the percentages of students who are saying they are having trouble balancing family and school, managing time, figuring out where to go to complete their coursework, worrying about food, the holistic piece of this conversation is even more critical than it was before. And if you look at the graph on the right, and I know it's small, it is an equity issue because our students of color are most disproportionately impacted by these concerns. Again, if you look at the state level, the story is the same. These are 2 studies. I really apologize for the California one. This was the best image I could get. This was actually a survey done by the Student Senate, so students themselves, so the quality was not great, but it's really important work. North Carolina, California, whatever survey you look at, students are saying the same thing. Like, this stuff matters. We knew it mattered before, and the COVID emergency has just laid bare the fact that students cannot learn if they cannot have help with their non-academic needs. So I'm doubling down on this matters. The other thing I want to tell you is that the principles of effective student support, that SIP, it doesn't change if you're online. So the Urban Institute had an impeccably timed report that nobody got to see because it came out in March. They've been working on it for over a year, looking at how we support students in online learning. It was literally a report on supporting online learners, came out in March, and then nobody paid attention because everyone was trying to go to online learning. But essentially what they found was these principles are the same. You need assigned advisors, you need a navigator, you need connections to holistic resources for online learners. So this doesn't change. The need gets greater and the principles remain the same. It's how we operationalize it, right? We've all quickly pivoted to Zoom. I hope that we continue to offer Zoom advising in perpetuity because there's no reason students should drive to campus just to meet with you. They can do it on Zoom or whatever your platform of choice is if they so desire. There's a lot actually that I think we're learning is propelling this work forward, because the other thing that we're learning is that the colleges that had already started this work were better positioned to address the emergency this spring. So this is actually the website of Indian River Community College. They're in Florida. They've been engaged in comprehensive redesign for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years. They have moved towards a SIP approach. They have a success team-ish approach. Within 3 weeks, wait, I got to grab my notebook. I don't want to get the number wrong. Within 3 weeks of pivoting, and of course I didn't mark it, they made, I'm going to say 6,000 phone calls to students to find out who had access to Wi-Fi and who didn't, who needed a laptop and who didn't. It wasn't just that they offered things like additional food support, a food pantry, hotspots. They targeted their outreach to make sure that the students who needed those hotspots could get them. They made 6,000 calls. I've been told the Alamo colleges, they're in Austin and Texas. I haven't spoken to them, but I was told this week that they made upward, they've also done comprehensive redesign, very SIPy, lots of things, 50,000 phone calls. The reason they can do that, or could do that, is because they had the architecture in place to do so. They had the architecture to say to their staff, you have your people, you know your people, go find them. And then they did, and then they hustled, and let me be clear, these people worked their tushies off. But they hustled and they were able to target the services they were providing to the students who needed it. So in this moment, having that architecture becomes even more critical. So I'm gonna pause there and stop, be about 5 minutes. I'm gonna look for a few more questions. There's so much more to say about this moment of a pandemic. There's so much more to say about the equity piece of this approach. But again, I come back to, we know that for the students who are most disproportionately harmed by our old structures, having a person who knows them, having someone who knows their story, knowing who to go to, who will honor their identity and the anxiety that they may be feeling, and I'm thinking again, particularly of our minoritized students, is a critical piece of making sure that college remains in the cards, right? Having a success structure or a SIP structure of any kind, having that person is so critical in this moment to let our students process what's happening in the world. The other piece, when I think about equity, for many students, there aren't a lot of folks on college campuses who look like them, and we know from social psychology that that matters. For all sorts of reasons, and the pipelines are not always what we want them to be to bring in folks at, say, a counselor level who come from the communities our students come from. An equity strategy to create those pipelines and to ensure that there's a critical mass of staff, student-facing staff of color, is to use things like navigators, roles that are maybe not master's level roles, but are student-facing, because those are who students engage with. You can recruit your navigators from your former students. They went to your school, they got a bachelor's in psychology, they can come back and be a navigator, even as they're in grad school to get a master's, for example. And so as a way to diversify staff, going to a team approach is really promising because it accelerates that timeline. Also, for better or worse, the navigators cost less than a master's levels person. That's the pragmatic side of me. So these strategies, they're hard, but I firmly believe in them because I think we see the data in all different places, and we see this playing out in many ways that seem to work for students. We have like 2 minutes. So I'm going to quickly skim. I don't even know if I can read that fast. I'm not sure I can. So what I'm going to do instead, someone's from San Antonio. Alamo, I hope I got that number right. but even if it was less than 50,000, it was 20,000, it was a lot, and yay, you all. So in San Antonio, I guess I got that wrong. That's my, not Austin. I'm glad I caught that comment. I'm going to just end by saying, I know this is a really hard time for everyone, and for those of us who are in those of you who are in student-facing positions, I thank you because this has not been easy, and I do want to lift up that you need to take care of yourselves too. Like, there's a lot more work to be done, but take care of yourselves. I want to end by thanking you again. You're so busy, and you're here, and it's early, and I'm grateful. My email is here. If you want to jot it down, please email me. I'm happy to engage with you. I'm happy to talk about ways to support your campus as you move forward with this work. I am easily findable, and I have such deep respect. I was a researcher, and I have spent much of my career speaking with students about the work that you do as well as with your colleagues. And it is just so critical. I think, again, if there's one good thing, and there aren't that many to come out of this moment, the fact that the work that you do is further elevated thrills me. And I'm looking forward, and I firmly believe that in a couple months we'll get to reflect on the changes you've made and integrate the good that you've done into something sustainable. And I look forward to learning from you when we get to that point. So I'm going to stop, say thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Be safe.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Melinda. That was awesome as usual. We are very excited at MCC because a lot of what you're saying, we are, in that path, and we are excited for what's coming. We're already seeing an impact of getting our structures together. And so we're really energized and excited. And as you were speaking about equity, I just want to remind everyone here that we do have a very, very good equity panel coming up, which is our last big session before we wind up today. So don't miss that. Make sure you're registered. The Zoom links have been sent to everyone. The next set of sessions we have coming up today are we have the Transition Summit, setting students up for success at 10:15, self-care in a pandemic, and of course, the hot topic for today is assessment. What do we assess in a COVID-19 pandemic? So make sure you join us for those sessions. Remember, we are on Twitter. You can tweet at us using the hashtag at MCC. Make sure that you put in your comments, and all of the presentations will be available as soon as we recover from 2 days of Zoom sessions, 8-hour-long sessions. So thank you, Melinda. I know this has been awesome. Thank you very much. I think, yep, awesome. And we will see you guys all later, the other side after the break. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.